Hello, my name's Andy. Welcome to this special episode of Keeping Water. This episode is a compilation of the 5 stages of my moving bed build that previously appeared in numerous regular episodes over the last couple of months. There's no additional content, but if you've not watched all the episodes or just want to watch the complete build in one easy viewing, then this is for you. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. At the very least, it may be interesting to watch someone bodge their way through a build and just about succeed at the end. And if nothing else, I prove that if I can do it, then anyone can too, and probably better. Right, let's get started. My plan for the moving bed was that it will be in the filter shed with the multi-bay and will be the last part of the filtration system before the water returns to the pond. I've had challenges even before construction, which were around the following. 1. As always, cost. It's easy enough to source suitable tubs to make a moving bed out of, but they can be expensive, especially if you want to be sure about durability and especially in the extremes of weather. 2. It needed to be deep enough, but also, as my system is pump fed and then gravity returned, the outlet on it needs to be at the same height as the multi-bay. However, I also wanted it to be a little off the ground to help with drainage. All this meant something like a large cylindrical tub wasn't going to be suitable. 3. I only had so much space in my shed to fit it in, so on top of everything else it couldn't be too wide. Therefore, although I was quite happy with the tub I got, and it was the perfect width and length, it isn't quite as deep as I'd like, but them's the breaks, I guess. So, the plan was to have a 2-inch inlet from the multi-bay towards the bottom of the moving bed, with a long pipe from it going almost to the far end of the tub. The thinking here was to allow the water to flow against the back wall and then be spread throughout the tub and media, rather than just flow straight to the outlet. There would then be an outlet towards the top, which would take water back to the pond. At the opposite end, at the bottom, would be a 1.5-inch outlet to use for cleaning and drainage. The original plan was to have both the inlet pipe and drainage outlet below a grid, which would keep the media above both of them and allow detritus to drop from the media to the bottom of the tub. In fact, as you'll see, I do drill the inlet hole with this plan still in mind. However, I didn't quite keep to it, as you'll see as I progress through the construction. The first step was to measure up. I'd love to say I always measure twice and cut once, but I really can't. In this case, the hole is wrong, but not due to my measuring, more about the decision making I previously mentioned. More later. Here I am drilling the first 2-inch hole, which is the inlet to the filter, through which water will enter the moving bed from the multi-bay. I think it makes quite a clean cut, but I'll do some cleaning up anyway in a bit. Now, I went for a nice slow-mo here as I thought it might be a bit dramatic or at the very least interesting. That didn't really work out, but I've left it in anyway. To clean up the hole I used sandpaper. As I said, it's quite a clean cut, so didn't need to do too much. I find that light sandpaper does the job nicely while keeping the shape of the hole. The next hole is the outlet to the filter, through which water will return to the pond. Again, a nice clean cut with only a little sandpaper work needed. Next, I do a test fit of the two bulkheads, just to check that they fit nice and flush, which they do. Next, I drill the 1.5 inch waste drain hole. I think I could have gone a little lower, but I wanted to be sure that the bulkhead fitted without any issues. Here I'm making the grid to hold the media away from the bottom of the tub and help with drainage. A quick measure and then it's relatively easy to cut the grids nice and straight, and super fast once you get the hang of it. Some more measuring and a couple more cuts and it's done. Joining the pieces together is pretty simple, as I can turn to my best friend's cable ties. I chose to use a tie along each of the holes of the grids. Not sure if this was overkill, but the result was pretty sturdy. I then just trimmed the ties for neatness and function. These grids are perfect in terms of strength and, to be honest, cost, but the holes are too big for some of the smaller media I'm likely to use in the bed. I therefore bought some smaller mesh that wouldn't be strong enough on its own, but works well in conjunction with the grid. To add it to the grid, rather than do lots of fancy measuring, I just laid a corner of the mesh over the grid, fixed it with, again, cable ties, and then cut around it afterwards. I deliberately left about an inch all the way round for a reason I'll discuss later. I think it turned out pretty good, and as you'll see, it fitted perfectly into position in the tub. The overlap of mesh was designed to cover any gaps between the grid and the tub, but as it turned out, there aren't any. On to gluing in some sections of rigid pipe into the bulkheads. They needed to be slightly staggered so they can pass by each other once connected into the rest of the system. I must admit I made an absolute meal of working this out, which I will somewhat try to cover up by fast forwarding a lot of this. Before there's any questions about the wisdom of using an old kitchen knife to start cuts in pipes, I have a really old rusty saw, and this is the best and easiest way of getting accurate straight cuts. I do some cleaning up here. I have to start with a Stanley knife before sandpaper, as my old saw makes a messier cut than my hole saws do. I then test fit the rubber 90 degrees, which I'll be using instead of solvent weld fittings, as I prefer the flexibility you have with them. Here is where I make a right mess of working out how long to make this section of rigid pipe to ensure that it passes the lower one. Eventually I get there, but it takes ages, even in fast forward. Here, I also realise that it needs to actually fit in its position in the filter shed, so I go out to the shed and check that. After much fussing about I get there, and then I can glue the pipes in. First I clean the bulkheads and the sections of pipe. Then I can apply the solvent weld glue to the inside of the bulkhead and the outside of the pipe, insert the pipe with a twist and hold it in place for a few seconds. Then I repeat that with the second pipe. Next, I'm going to use more of the mesh to cover the inlets and outlets to prevent media from escaping the moving bed. As you'll see, I accurately guesstimate the amount I need, hold it in place and fix with some cable ties, and then cut away any excess. Definitely craftsmanship. Anyway, I didn't get a great camera angle here. You can see better on another pipe in a bit. As a brief interlude from covering pipes, I once again use cable ties for yet another purpose, this time to make some handles for lifting the grid in and out. Again, sorry for the camera angle. Back to covering pipes, and this time it's the inlet pipe. Again, just using a rough amount of mesh, attaching with 2 cable ties, and then cutting back any excess. Right, a final look. As I've suggested, I made one big mistake when making this. As I said at the beginning, I originally planned to have the inlet pipe under the grid, and indeed cut the first hole with this in mind. The result meant that the depth of the available space for the media was just too restricted, especially considering that the tub wasn't as deep as I would have liked it in the first place. The fix is to place the grid over the drainage outlet as planned and then under the inlet. This means the space below the grid is about 2 inches at the lowest end and about 4 inches at the deepest end. I think that will be okay, but time will tell. Being lower down in the narrowing tub means the grid wedges in, but I will add supports to stop the lowest end from dropping any lower. So, that's most of the initial construction complete. I'm going to glue in the drainage pipework when it's in situ, as it will be easier to work out positioning. I'm not planning to glue the inlet pipe in, as 1, it makes it easier to remove the grid, and 2, I may change it in the future. The next stage of installation will be connecting it up to the system in the filter shed, but that won't be for a couple of weeks as there's other work I'm going to do at the same time. I'm also going to complete some leak tests on the moving bed before then. Before I start, I need to explain that quite a lot of the process was not recorded due to my GoPro being temperamental. However, I think there's enough to give a good enough account of what I've done and how well it's gone. Right, I'll start where we left this after stage 1 of making the moving bed. I'd installed the bulkheads, made and positioned the grid and completed a leak test. There were a couple of leaks, but only on the temporary pipework I'd attached, rather than the bulkheads or more permanent fittings. So, the first preparation job for stage 2 was to glue some permanent pipework to the drainage bulkhead and attach the temporary pipework properly to the inlet and then retest. Both passed, so I was good to go. The last preparation job for stage 2 was to check on a potential problem. My current setup has 1.5 inch pipework from the pump into the filter and then 1.5 inch pipework from the filter back to the pond. The problem with this is that I have to reduce the flow from the pump to prevent the filter from overflowing. My plan therefore was, as I was overhauling the filtration anyway, I should resolve this and change the outlet from the filter to 2 inch pipework. However, there was a potential issue where the outlet connected underground to the 4 inch pipe that was built into the wall of the walled area. Therefore, to check this out, I dug away some earth in the walled area to both free the old pipework and gain access to the rubber reducer that connected the 1.5 inch pipe to the 4 inch. However, with the earth removed, I found that the reducer itself was embedded in the mortar, so things weren't going to be as easy as I'd hoped. But still, it shouldn't be too difficult, and I should be able to chip away at the mortar to release the rubber reducer without the whole wall collapsing, wouldn't I? So, on to stage 2 proper. The first job was to disconnect the multibay from the pipework in the shed and move it outside. I then used my submersible pump, which pays for itself almost every day, to pump water through the filter to keep things going while I work. I then narrowed the drainage pipework to reduce the multibay's footprint and make room for the moving bed in the shed. With some 2 inch pipework connected to the multibay instead of the original 1.5 inch, there was no overflowing, something that had happened when I used a submersible pump on the filter during my recent electrical problems. So this was a good sign that I'd be able to have a greater flow rate through the filter with the larger pipework. The next job was to solve the pipework and mortar problem. As always, I didn't really have the right tools, so I used a flat-edge screwdriver and a hammer and carefully chipped away at the mortar. It actually went okay, and I could release the reducer and create enough room to accurately attach the new one. And the wall didn't collapse, so happily, that was the first problem overcome. The next job was to address the shed floor. Water damage from leaks and clumsiness hadn't done the floor any good. Now, I probably should have completely replaced it, but that would have meant dismantling most of the shed, and, well, I kind of chickened out of doing that. Anyway, my plan for the time being was to add some waterproof membrane on top of the old floor, then a new floor made of OSB, and then cover that with vinyl flooring. At the very least, this would prevent further damage, as the vinyl floor would mean that any leaks and spills could be mopped up without causing any harm. With that done, although unfortunately not properly recorded due to the GoPro turning itself off, I could then turn my attention to positioning the filters in the shed and connecting the pipework. This was tricky, very tricky. Firstly, I had to get the height of the outlet on the moving bed and the height of the outlet on the multi-bay to match as closely as possible. I also had to ensure that the moving bed was as far to the left as possible to be able to fit the multi-bay back in. After getting the height pretty close, I then connected the outlet pipework, although only loosely fixed to the moving bed at first, to allow some flexibility when moving in the multi-bay. Although completing that still proved to be an absolute nightmare of a Tetris puzzle, but I did get it in, and then was just about able, in the very limited space, to connect the pipework in place, linking the two filters and the pipework to the outlet. I then plumbed in the inlet pipework, turned the pump on and started filling the system. I'll talk about that tower later. To begin with, I kept the flow low, as I wanted to test for leaks and balance before looking at increasing the flow rate. Initial checks, pink towel aside, didn't show any leaks. The bubbles here show what I'd hoped the flow into the moving bed would do, spread reasonably equally and mixing, rather than a narrow flow straight back to the outlet. Still no leaks, except for that towel. Finally, it reaches the top of both the multi-bay and the moving bed and begins flowing through the outlet and back to the pond. A quick check here of the outlet. I've not buried it yet until I'm sure there's no leaks, although none so far. By the way, there's a joint here to allow the flexible pressure pipe to make an S shape. I have found two leaks, both very small. One near the valve where the water enters from the pond, where the pink towel is. This was a problem that I'd had previously and thought was fixed. The other is at the last fixing where the rigid pipe joins the flexible pipe. It's a small drip every almost minute or so and was quite hard to spot. I've ordered some new fittings to correct both of them, which I'll cover in next week's episode. For the time being, the towels are doing the job. As well as fixing them, over the next week I'll be adding the media, setting up some temporary aeration and hopefully tinkering with the flow rate. The plans for stage 3 of the moving bed build were to add the media, fix the small leaks and see how much I could increase the flow through the filter now that I had larger outlet pipework. I wanted a media specifically for moving beds, so this would include K1 Micro, K+, Helex and Eco Pond Chip. Now the first three are very similar in design, the pond chips being a very different take on a high surface area media. To decide which one to use, I read up as much as I could. which was where the pond chips dropped out of the running, as I couldn't find as much independent info as for the other 3. On the info I had, they did seem promising, and maybe something I consider in the future. As to the remaining 3, Helex and K1 Micro had less surface area than K+, and were a similar price. However, K+ both had the larger advertised surface area for bacteria to colonise, and were slightly cheaper. This fairly pragmatic criteria led me to choosing it for my moving bed. There was one slight worry, however. 2 well thought of YouTubers had had problems with finding large amounts of swarf in their bags of K+, and this not being something you'd like to end up in your pond. However, forewarned is forearmed, so I went ahead and bought some. I would, however, spend some time, about an hour I thought, sifting through the media for swarf before adding it to the filter. This ended up taking a little longer than an hour though, as you can see. It was quite annoying to remove it as it stuck fast not only to the media but also to my hands, sleeves and anything other than what I wanted to remove it to. So, after 2 hours plus, I'd finished and was really happy to, and could begin adding the K+ to the moving bed. I ummed and ahed about how to, but decided to dump pretty much all of it in at once. I'm nothing if not a subtle and considered pond keeper. Now, there was one potential problem I'd been ignoring since I made the filter. Preventing the media from exiting the moving bed, I had some mesh covering the outlet pipe, which works fine. The problem though is that the media will obviously be pulled towards it, and the comparatively small surface area of the outlet means the water will have a high speed per square inch. Therefore, this speed of the water flowing through the mesh and the outlet could hold increasing amounts of media against it, potentially restricting the flow of the water through the system. Which it did. And then the moving bed started to overflow. Well, the water level began rising, but as I was partially aware of the risk, I was in the shed and spotted it happening before it actually overflowed. So, how to resolve it? Some use a long cylinder with slots in to increase the area of the outlet, slow down the speed of flow through the outlet and reduce the blockage. Now, this can take some tinkering to get right, and although I like tinkering, I'm also quite impatient. So instead, I thought what was the best way of increasing the surface area of any barrier between the media and the outlet? The answer to which was, obviously, a grid across the whole width and height of the moving bed. Well, that was the answer I came to. Therefore, I made a barrier out of the last of my media grid offcuts, connected it together with cable ties and covered it again with some of the fine mesh I had left. I made it slightly too large, which helps with its friction fit. Also, the pressure from water and media helps keep it in place. And it works. Obviously, it could be considered a hammer to crack a nut type of solution, and I do lose some space for media in the bed, but I'm happy with it for now. I may make an improved version and or fix it more securely in place, but for now I'll say it's a prototype and leave it be. Next it was time to add media. This time I decided to add some slowly over time. I also added some temporary aeration to start to get it moving. I'm not sure what I'm going to use long term. I'll see how the single disc works once the media matures and take it from there. Next it was time to address the leaks. The first was at the slide valve where the water enters from the pond. If you've watched the previous episode, it had a small drip that I was mopping up with a towel while I waited for parts. This connection has always been a little temperamental, so I plan to replace the valve and glue in some more connections. All I then needed to do was replace that section. However, once I checked it in the shed and removed the delightful towel, it didn't appear to be leaking anymore. I therefore replaced the towel with some paper towel just in case, and then moved on to the second leak. The second leak was an even slower drip where the rigid pipework from the moving bed joined the flexible pressure pipe. It was pretty slow, and like the first one, had stopped when I checked it. I'd also bought a new part for this one, but again, I'm leaving it for now. Finally, in stage 3 of the moving bed build, I looked at increasing the flow through the filter. For background, if you've not seen previous episodes, my filter is pump fed through 1.5 inch pipe and returns the water also through 1.5 inch pipe. As you may know, water won't exit via gravity as fast as it enters via a pump, so to balance it, you need to have a larger diameter pipework outlet than you do as an inlet. As my pump is not variable, I placed an old splitter after the pump in the pond so that I could adjust how much water was pumped to the filter. This worked, although it does have negatives, especially in terms of there being more plastic in the pond for the fish to potentially injure themselves on. In stage 2, I replaced the 1.5 inch outlet pipework with 2 inch. After giving the moving bed a week or more for teething problems, I then increased the flow to the filter. To do this, I use this handy tool I've made that prevents me having to get into the pond even more than I do already. It fits neatly over the tap on the splitter and allows some reasonably accurate adjustment. I then took some photos of the water level in the filter and then, 12 hours later, some after photos. No apparent change, so no problems with the increase. I've some thinking to do, however, about whether I want to increase further. The issues are dwell time in both the moving bed and UV, e.g. moving water too quick through either isn't always better. I also need to consider noise, as the water is quite a bit louder coming out of the outlet. And finally, I have some vague plans to change the outlet, and I'd like to be certain about that before changing flow rates too permanently. So, that's the end of stage 3 of the moving bed build. I'm pretty happy. There's been some teething issues, but when is there ever not? And nothing impossible to solve. I'll update in a few weeks in stage 4, once I've decided on aeration, put in as much media as possible, and also made a decision about flow rates. The first bit of work I completed on the moving bed this week was to start to address the aeration. I've changed the tubing to ordinary hose pipe, which both fits everything nicely and is quite cost effective as I've lots of spare parts to use. I've 2 aims. Firstly, to easily switch between the moving bed and the static bed to agitate the static bed when cleaning. Secondly, to allow flexibility in how the air is provided to the moving bed to get the best movement of media. I've partly addressed the first, but would like to add a tapped Y piece to allow more simple usage rather than swapping the pipe over. For the second, I need to wait a little longer to allow the media to mature before working out the final setup. The next job I had to do was due to a problem. I woke one morning to find quite a lot of K+ floating on the top of the pond. After collecting it, my first thought was that it was sneaking out of the sides of the barrier in the moving bed, but on checking it didn't seem likely. As you can see here, there's media under the bottom tray, which wouldn't suggest it was escaping over or around the barrier. Instead, I found that it was escaping between the end of the bottom tray and the near side of the tub. As you may have seen in the previous episode, my impatience gets in the way of too much tweaking and testing, so rather than make small adjustments to the tray, test and then refine until I'd solved it, I came up with an idea I was fairly sure would fix it in one go. My plan, therefore, was to make a mesh insert for the complete bed, therefore preventing any gaps. I kept the barrier, made a hole for the inlet pipe and checked there were no gaps around it. And it works. No escaping media, no blocked outlets. My lack of sophisticated DIY skills means it's a little messy and ugly, but function wins every time in my mind, so I'm definitely calling it a win for now. The next job was to address the noisy outlet. Since increasing the size of the outlet pipework and therefore being able to increase the flow through the filter, the flow of water has been particularly loud. So the plan was to split the flow from the outlet, sending half to the existing drain pipe in the wall and half to a new outlet, which would output below water level. The challenges were to install the splitter in a pretty tight space without any leaks and to make a hole through the mortar in the wall for a second outlet. It turns out that installing the splitter went well and, I think, looks pretty neat for me, especially as I prioritise function, as I've said. Making the hole through the mortar was really difficult, but I got there, and the end result means I've still got increased flow, but with less noise. Additionally, I have some flow downwards towards one of the dead spots in the pond where detritus collects, so a definite win. I've also tidied up the filter shed, put the covers on the filters and even added a doormat. Once I've sorted the aeration, I'll tidy up the air lines and the electric cables, and then, for this year at least, it will be done. Obviously as long as nothing else goes wrong. The first tweak I've made is really for the whole system, not just the moving bed, but it's very much due to the work I completed as part of installing it. To complete this, I use my patented underwater splitter tap tool that allows me to adjust the flow through the splitter. The reason I have this splitter is to limit the flow into the multi-bay to prevent overflowing. However, since increasing the outlet pipe diameter, the system can take a greater flow rate. So the tweak here is to totally close off one tap and send all the water from the pump into the filter. The second of my high-tech gadgets is some tape I've used to mark the level in the vortex, or just below it because I'm a little inaccurate, so I can see if there's any increase in the multi-bay, which would be the first sign of it potentially overflowing. Anyway, a day later and there's no real sign of an increase, so I'm reasonably confident. I'll give it a week or so and then I can remove the splitter, meaning one less piece of plastic in the pond, which can only be a good thing. The next tweak was to make some changes to the aeration in the moving bed. The two aims here were to add a splitter between the static and moving beds to make swapping between them simpler, and the second was to add some additional air stones into the moving bed to hopefully improve movement. I'm going to speed through a lot of this as once again the camera position is awful and you can't see most of it. In my defence, it is tricky filming in the tiny shed, but I really should do better. So, all done, and let's have a look. Firstly, I've put a splitter to add aeration. On one pipe I've narrowed it down to some smaller tubing and added a four-way splitter to then add some air stones. I've only got two at the moment, so I've used some one-way valves to close off the unused ones. From the splitter with taps, the pipes go to each bed. Most of the time this will be giving air to the moving bed, but when cleaning I can switch this and use the air to help clean the K1 in the static bed. It's still messy, so I need to do some tidying, and I also need to see how the moving bed functions when I add two more air stones and the media's matured more. It may be that the air pump's not quite up to keeping it moving, but we'll wait and see. This is the last of the main updates on the moving bed. I'm calling it done for now. I'll obviously update when I complete smaller tweaks and when water testing. I hope you've enjoyed this build video. If I complete any more tweaking of the moving bed, I'll include it in future weekly episodes. If you've not subscribed and you don't want to miss that, or any of the other projects I'm completing or my videos capturing my pond's fish, consider subscribing to the channel. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.